The cattle baron came home after 8 years. She had kept his rocking chair empty. The gate was still crooked. I'd meant to fix it the spring before I left, and I hadn't, and now 8 years had passed and it hung at the same angle it always had, a little low on the left side where the post had settled into soft ground. I sat my horse at the end of the lane and looked at it a long time, longer than I should have. A man coming home after 8 years ought to ride right in, ought to kick his horse and go. I didn't. The cottonwoods were taller. That was the thing that hit me first, before the gate, before anything else. I'd planted those 3 trees the year we built the house, the spring after Ruth then, and I came out from Abilene with nothing but a freight wagon and a belief that the land up here was good. They'd been saplings then, head high maybe, and thin enough that one hard wind might have laid them over. Now they were real trees. They threw shade across the whole east side of the yard, and the leaves were going yellow because it was October, and the air had that particular cold edge to it that I'd almost forgotten. That high country cold that smells like iron and dry grass, and the first suggestion of snow still 2 weeks off. I'd been gone 8 years. I want to say that clear because the length of it is the whole of the thing. Not 8 months, not a year, 8 years. My boy Calvin was 11 when I left. He'd be 19 now, or close enough to it. My daughter Elsa had been 8, and she'd wept at the gate, that same crooked gate, and I'd told her I'd be back before she missed me, and I had not been back and she had missed me, and I did not know yet what she looked like now or what kind of woman she'd become, only that she'd become one whether I was here for it or not. My name is Harlan Cade. I was 58 years old that October morning. I'd built this ranch from raw ground. I'd been, before I left, a man people knew and respected in Colfax County, not because I was rich, though we'd gotten comfortable, but because I kept my word and I ran clean cattle and my hands ate the same food I did. That was the man I'd been. What I was when I rode back up that lane, I wasn't sure yet. I had a fair idea it wasn't the same. I'd gone in service of something I've never fully explained and won't explain here because it doesn't belong in this telling. There were men who needed escorting through difficult country, and I was the man the army asked to do it, and I did it, and it took the time it took and cost what it cost. That's enough. The point isn't where I'd been. The point is what it had made of me and what I found when I came home. I touched the horse forward. He was a roan I'd bought in Taos 3 weeks earlier, a solid short-coupled animal with a white blaze and no particular opinion about anything, which was about what I needed. My own horse, a gray gelding I'd called Gus, and no, I don't care how that sounds, had died 4 years in, up in Montana territory in mud up to his chest, and I'd buried what I could of him and walked 2 days to the next town, and that had been the first time I understood I might not be coming back. Not because of the walking, because of how little I felt when I buried him. That horse and I had been together 7 years. I'd bought him the spring after Calvin was born. And I put him in the ground in the mud and I walked away, and I felt almost nothing. That's what the years do. You think they harden you. They don't exactly. They hollow you. There's a difference. A hard thing is still solid. A hollow thing just looks the same from the outside. The roan walked up the lane and the yellow cottonwood leaves came down around us, one at a time, slow the way they fall in no wind. I passed the gate. I could see the house now, and it was the same and different both. The same white paint, though it needed another coat. The porch was still there. The steps still had the third one with the knot hole in it that had always made a particular sound, different from all the others. There was smoke coming from the chimney. Of course there was. It was October, and Ruth then had always had the morning fire going before dawn. She was out before I reached the porch. I don't know if she heard the horse or saw me from the window. She came through the door and stopped on the top step, and she had a dish towel in her hands. She'd been drying something, and she stood there and looked at me. She was 54 years old. She'd been 46 when I left. Her hair had some silver in it now that hadn't been there, and there were lines around her eyes that I hadn't put there that the 8 years had put there, and she was thinner than I remembered. But her eyes were the same. Dark brown, almost black in certain light, and steady. That was always the word for Ruth then. Steady. She looked at me the way you look at something you've been expecting so long that, when it finally comes, you're not sure if you're really seeing it. I got down from the horse. My knees weren't what they'd been. I didn't make any sound about it, but I was aware of it, aware of how long it took me to get down and straighten up, aware that I was moving like a man who'd been sleeping on ground more nights than a bed. I took the reins and I stood there with the horse between us, about 20 feet of hard-packed yard separating me from my wife, and neither of us said anything. She came down the steps. She walked across the yard. She stopped in front of me. She looked at my face the way you look at a map you haven't needed in a long time, making sure you still know the territory. "Harlan," she said. "Ruth." She reached up and put her hand on the side of my face. Just her palm, flat against my cheek, the way you'd check if a child had fever. Her hand was warm and it was rough. She'd been working with those hands every day for 8 years and you could feel it, and I just about came apart right there in the yard. I didn't. I held. "You look like you walked here from the edge of the world," she said. "Road," I said, "mostly." She put her other hand on the other side of my face. She was looking at me and I could not read all of what was in her eyes, there was too much of it, but I could read that she wasn't angry. I'd been afraid of the anger. 8 years was a long time to leave a woman alone with a ranch and 2 children and no certainty you were ever coming back. She'd have had reason. "You came back," she said. I said I did. "Good," she said, "just that good." And she dropped her hands and took the reins from me and led the roan toward the barn without looking back. And I stood in my own yard in the October cold, and I didn't know whether to laugh or sit down in the dirt. I didn't do either. I followed her. Calvin was out on the North Range and wouldn't be back until afternoon. Elsa was in town. She'd married a man named Prout who ran the feed store, which I hadn't known, which hit me the way those things do when you hear them and realize how much world has moved without you. Ruth then told me this while she unsaddled the roan, and I stood there and let her, because she'd already started and there was no graceful way to take over, and anyway she was faster than I was and had been working this barn for 8 years by herself. "Prout," I said, "is he a good man?" She looked at me across the horse's back. "He is. He's decent and he works and he doesn't drink to excess. Elsa seems content." Seems content. Not happy, not joyful content. Ruth then never oversold a thing. It was one of the first things I'd loved about her 30 years ago. It was still. "Grandchildren," I said, and then felt the word in my mouth strange and new. "One, a boy, named him Martin after Ruth's father." I hadn't known that either. I was a grandfather. I had a grandson named Martin and I didn't know his face. I found the grain bin where it had always been and measured out a portion for the roan. And while I did that, Ruth then filled the water and we worked around each other in the barn the way people who know the same space well enough will do. There's a choreography to it. We didn't bump into each other once. When we were done, she leaned against the stall rail and crossed her arms. Not in a closed-off way, in the way she always did when she was about to say something real. "You've got something on you," she said. "Something different." 8 years worth of something, I said. "Not just years." She was looking at me straight. "I've had men come back from wars, Harlan. My brother came back from the war and he was different, but I could still see him in there. I'm looking at you and I can see you, but you're—" She stopped, found the word. "Quieter, down deep somewhere, like a well that used to run full and something's happened to the water level." I turned away from her, looked at the roan settling in. "I'm all right," I said. She didn't say anything for a moment. "I didn't ask if you were all right," she said. "I said you were quieter." She put me to work that afternoon. Not the way you'd think, not hauling fence rails or fixing the gate, though both of those things eventually, but small work. Kindling. The wood box was low, and she handed me the hatchet and pointed at the block behind the house, and I split wood for an hour. It was what I needed without knowing I needed it. The hatchet in my hand, the wood giving way clean when I hit it right, the smell of pine sap in the cold air. My hands doing a thing they knew. I filled the wood box. I found a broken latch on the chicken coop and fixed it with wire I found in the barn. I walked the south fence line, not because I'd been asked to, but because I wanted to be moving and I wanted it to be this land under my feet. The ranch was in better shape than I deserved to find it. The house was sound. The barn was solid. The herd Ruthen walked me out to see it before dark, and there were more cattle on the place than when I'd left. She'd bought 20 head 3 years in when the price was low, and she'd bred them right, and now the herd was strong and the bloodlines were better than what I'd left her. I stood at the fence looking at those cattle, and something in my chest did something complicated. "You built this," I said, not meaning it as a question. "We built it," she said. "Calvin worked when he was old enough. I hired Paco Reyes and he's still here." I knew Paco, good hand, honest. "Still," I said. She leaned on the fence rail beside me. We stood there looking at the cattle in the last of the afternoon light. The sky had gone the color of creek ice, that pale yellow-gray before dark that you only get in the high country in fall. "I want you to understand something," she said, and her voice was level, not hard, but plain. "I wasn't waiting for you, Harlan, not in the way that hurts a person. I made this place work because it needed to work and because our children needed something to stand on. I didn't spend 8 years pining. I was too busy." I looked at her profile. "I know that," I said. "I'm telling you because I don't want you feeling like you owe me something desperate," she said. "Like you've got to make it right all at once. That's not what this is." "What is it then?" She looked at the cattle a while. "An opportunity," she said, "to see if the man who left here is still somewhere inside the man who came back." I didn't have an answer for that. She hadn't asked for one. Calvin came in around 5. I heard the horse, then the barn door, then his boots on the porch. I was sitting at the kitchen table when he came through the door. He stopped. He was a large young man. I mean that not in the way of fat, but in the way of solid. He'd got my height and then some, and he was broad through the shoulder in a way I hadn't been at his age. His face was mine, or the young version of mine, and it did something to me to see it looking back at me from across the kitchen, something I was not prepared for. He said, "Pa." He didn't cross the room. He just stood there with his hat in his hand, and I realized he was waiting for something from me before he was going to give anything back. I'd left when he was 11. He'd had time to form a full opinion. I stood up. "Calvin," I said. A moment went by. He crossed the room and put out his hand, not for an embrace, a handshake. It told me something. He was willing to start, but we were starting from scratch. I shook his hand. His grip was a working man's grip. "You're taller than I expected," I said. "You're older than I expected," he said, not cruel, just true. We ate dinner, the 3 of us, and it was not easy, but it was real. Calvin asked direct questions, and I answered them as direct as I could without getting into the parts I wasn't able to get into. Where I'd been, what the country was like. He had questions about horses and cattle, and I could answer those. He was good at the land. I could see that in how he talked about it, the particular specificity of a man who knows a piece of ground the way you know a person. He asked me once, toward the end of the meal, what I'd been doing all that time. I told him I'd been escorting people who needed escorting through country that didn't want to let them pass. He looked at me across the table for a moment, a long moment, and then he said, "Was it worth it?" And I said, "I think it was, for them." And he said, "But not for you." And I said I wasn't sure yet, which was the most honest answer I had, and he nodded once and picked up his fork again, and that was the end of that line of questioning. I respected him for the asking and for the stopping. A lesser man would have pushed or would have let it go entirely. He'd found the midpoint, which told me something about how he'd grown. After dinner, he went out to check on something in the barn, and Ruth then washed up and I dried and we didn't talk, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people in a shared space, which is different from the silence of two people with nothing to say. "He's going to be all right," she said about Calvin. "He's already all right," I said. "I can see that." "I mean about you." I put a plate away where I thought it went and she reached past me and moved it to the right cabinet without commenting. "I'd put it wrong. 8 years. You'll figure out where things go again," she said. I didn't sleep well that first night. I hadn't slept well in years, but it was particular that first night. We had a room still, our room, and she hadn't moved into a different arrangement, which I'll admit I'd wondered about on the ride in. But I was careful of her, and careful wasn't the right word maybe, but it was the one I had. I didn't know where I stood yet. You don't come back after 8 years and assume. I lay in the dark and listened to the house. It had its own sounds and they were strange to me and familiar at the same time. The creak from the hall that had always been there. The way the wind found a gap somewhere on the north side of the roof and made a particular low sound. The cottonwoods, which were bigger now and threw a bigger sound in the wind. Ruth then was asleep beside me, turned away, her breathing slow and even. Around midnight I got up. I put on my boots and my coat and went out to the porch. The air was sharp, a real bite in it now. The sky was clear and the stars were out, that particular abundance of stars you only get at elevation, more of them than you can look at, so many that the dark between them seems like the thing added later. I sat down in the chair on the porch, or I started to. The rocking chair was on the right side of the porch where it had always been. I'd built that chair myself the second summer we were on the place. Oak. It had held up. I put my hand on the arm of it before I sat down, and I noticed something. There was no wear on the arm the way there would be if someone had been sitting in it. The wood wasn't smooth in the way of regular use. It looked the same as it had looked when I left, near enough. I stood there with my hand on the arm of that chair. In the morning I would ask her, and she would tell me she'd sat on the steps, or in the kitchen, or other places. She hadn't sat in that chair. Whether she'd done it intentional or just naturally avoided it, the result was the same. The chair had been here the whole 8 years I'd been gone on this porch, and nobody had sat in it. I sat down. The familiar complaint of the joints, the particular backward swing of that chair with its specific rhythm. I sat there in the dark and cold and rocked, slow, and the weight of the whole 8 years came down on me, quiet and heavy, the way real weight comes not all at once but settling, like a pack you've been carrying all day and only feel when you finally put it down. I was not a man given to breaking. I hadn't broken out there. Not when I should have, not in circumstances that would have excused it. But sitting in that chair on my own porch, with the stars over my own land and the smell of my own cottonwoods and the sound of my own house, I got close to it. Not the weeping kind. The other kind, the kind that's just a long, slow exhale, like pressure releasing from something that's been sealed too long. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough that the cold had gotten into my hands. Long enough that the Big Dipper had moved. And then the front door opened behind me, quiet, and Ruth then came out in her coat and her boots over her nightgown. And she stood there a moment before she sat down on the top step the way she apparently had for 8 years. She didn't say anything for a while. I didn't either. "You found the chair," she said eventually. "The arms aren't worn," I said. "No." I wanted to ask her why. I didn't. Some things you let stand. "There's something wrong with me, Ruth," I said, and it was harder to say than I thought it would be. Not the way a wound is wrong. More like, I said hollow before to myself. That word. I've been running so long that coming to a stop feels strange. Like I don't know what standing still means anymore. She was quiet. "I know what I'm supposed to feel coming home," I said. "I know how it's supposed to work. Relief and gratitude and all the rest. I can feel the edge of those things. But there's distance between me and them. like I'm looking at them through glass. She turned to look at me then, there in the dark, just her face toward me. "That's not something wrong with you," she said. "That's something that happened to you. There's a difference." I didn't say anything. "You think I don't see you," she said. "You think you came back and I'm seeing some version of you I made up while you were gone, and I'll be disappointed when the real one turns up." She shook her head, a small motion. "I see you, Harlan, the man who's sitting in that chair right now, the hollowed out one, the one who doesn't know what standing still means. That's the man I'm talking to. That's the man I kept the chair for." I looked at her. "I didn't think you'd come back," she said, plain as weather. "About 3 years in, I stopped thinking you would, not because of anything you did, because of what it looked like from here. And I made my arrangements, in my head, I mean. And then the years went by and I didn't change the arrangements. I just kept going, kept the chair." She paused. "I don't know why I kept the chair. I think I knew something I didn't want to admit to knowing." I was quiet a long time. "I almost didn't come back," I said. "I want you to know that because I think you already know it, and I'd rather say it than let it sit unsaid. Not because of you, not because of the children, because of me. Because I didn't know if the man who built this place was still available, and I didn't know what I'd be bringing back if he wasn't." She looked at me steadily. "Is he?" she said. I thought about it. Not the way you think about an answer you want to give, the way you think about the true one. "Parts of him," I said. She nodded. She looked back at the dark. "Parts is enough to work with," she said. "I'll tell you what the first weeks were. Not what I'd expected. I'd expected to be useful, and I wasn't, not at first, not in the ways that counted. Calvin and Paco Reyes had the ranch running on a rhythm they'd built without me, and coming into that rhythm and finding my place in it was harder than I thought. I kept reaching for jobs that were already done, or doing things at the wrong time, or second-guessing men who knew the place better than I did. Calvin watched me with patient eyes. He wasn't unkind. He was careful with me the way you're careful with something you don't fully trust yet, which was fair. I'd left when he was 11, and I was going to have to earn my way back in, and I knew it, and I was willing to do the earning. Paco Reyes shook my hand the second morning and didn't say much about the years. He was that kind of man. He showed me what had changed and where things were now and treated me like a man capable of learning, which was more than I deserved. I fixed the gate in the first week. I don't know why I made that the thing I did first, except that it had been the first thing I saw, and it had been wrong when I left it, and it had stayed wrong, and I could fix it. I reset the post and rehung the hardware, and that gate swung clean and sat level, and I stood back and looked at it, and it was a small thing, and it was not a small thing. Ruth then watched from the porch. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't need to. In the second week, Ruth then told me she needed to go into Cimarron for supplies and asked if I wanted to come. I said yes, and I wish I'd thought it through more before saying it, because I hadn't been in a town of any consequence in. I couldn't have told you how long. Towns had been places to pass through, to resupply at and move on. I'd stopped being a man who lived in proximity to people who knew his name. We drove the buckboard in together. She handled the reins and I rode alongside, which was not how it used to be, and I noticed it without saying anything. It was her team and her wagon and her routine, and I was fitting into it, not the other way. The town knew I was back. Of course it did. The ranch is not so far out that word doesn't travel, and in a place the size of Cimarron word travels faster than horses. The first man I saw when we pulled up in front of the mercantile was Tom Ellerby, who had the feed store before Prout married into it, and Ellerby looked at me with his mouth open for just a moment before he put his hand out. "Harlan Cade," he said, "we had heard you were back." "Tom," I said, and shook his hand. "Long time," he said. "It is," I said. And that was all we had, really. Tom Ellerby and I had never been more than county acquaintances, the kind of men who knew each other's business dealings but not each other, and after 8 years there was less between us than there'd been before. He moved on. A few other men did versions of the same thing, the recognizing, the handshake, the brief statement of time passed, and then moving on. It was in the mercantile that I understood something. The man who'd run that store when I left, a man named Birch, heavyset, with a pinched manner, and a habit of commenting on what you bought, had died. Ruth then had told me this on the ride in, 2 years prior, a lung sickness. Now his daughter ran it, a woman of about 30, brisk and businesslike in the way of someone who'd had to grow up fast. She knew Ruth then well, that was clear. They talked while she gathered the order, an ease between them of women who dealt with each other regularly and built a small trust. And I stood in the middle of that store and felt myself invisible. Not unkindly. Nobody meant anything by it. But I had been a man people knew in this town, a man who'd built the biggest cattle operation in the eastern part of the county and had a reputation for square dealing. And now I was standing in the mercantile while my wife ran the errands and people looked at me with polite recognition and no particular weight. 8 years had shifted things. The weight I'd carried here had spread elsewhere, or dissipated, or been redistributed to men who'd stayed. I didn't begrudge it. I'm telling you this because you need to understand what I was working against inside myself in those first weeks. It wasn't only the hollowness of what the years had done. It was the recognition that the place I'd left wasn't waiting for me in the shape I'd left it. The land was near enough. The house was near enough. The people weren't. Calvin wasn't. Elsa wasn't. She was a woman with her own life. Even Ruth then wasn't the same woman I'd left, though she was better, not worse, and I mean that without sentiment. The man I'd been didn't fit back into the space he'd vacated. I had to find out what fit instead. Calvin and I started working together properly about 10 days in. Not because of any arrangement, just because the work landed that way. Paco had a section of fence that needed new posts on the southwest corner, and Calvin was going, and I said I'd come along, and neither of us made anything of it. We loaded the wagon with posts and tools and drove out there in the early morning with the cold coming off the grass and our breath showing. We worked for a while without talking, which was fine. The work itself provided a kind of conversation, the rhythm of it, who held the post while who drove it, who went for the next tool. You learn things about a man from working alongside him, how he handles a thing that's going wrong, whether he gets frustrated or stays methodical, whether he expects you to read his mind or makes his intentions plain. Calvin was methodical and plain. He told you what he needed. He didn't expect you to guess. We broke at midday and ate cold biscuits from his coat pocket, and I said, "You've done a good job with this place." He ate half a biscuit before he answered. "Ma did," he said. "I helped when I got old enough." "I know," I said. "I'm saying you both did, and you did." He looked at the fence line we'd repaired. "She never said a word against you," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever she thought, and I don't know all of what she thought, she kept it to herself, in front of us." I didn't say anything. "I didn't always," he said. "When I was younger I had some hard feelings I let out sometimes. I regret the ones I let out at her. Not the ones at me." A pause, almost a smile. "Those were warranted," he said. "Yeah," I said, "they were." We sat there eating biscuits in the cold, 2 men next to a fence line, and it was the closest we'd come yet to something real. Not warmth exactly, not forgiveness exactly. More like the acknowledgement that we were here and it was complicated, and we were going to work alongside each other anyway and see what happened. That was the start of Calvin and me. He didn't forgive me all at once, and I didn't ask him to. You don't come back after 8 years and receive forgiveness like a package left on the porch. You earn it in the particulars, one morning at a time, one fixed fence at a time, one conversation at a time. I understood that, and I was willing for it to take as long as it took. The hardest part was the nights. Not sleeping next to her, that came back to us with a naturalness I hadn't let myself expect, the body's memory being longer than the mind's estrangement. but the nights in my own head. The things that came up when the house was quiet. The faces, the places, things I'd seen and done and witnessed in those 8 years that I'd kept at arm's length while they were happening, because you have to, because if you let them in when they're happening, they'll stop you from functioning, and then in the quiet they find their way in regardless. I didn't tell her everything. I want to be clear about that. Some of it wasn't mine to tell, and some of it was mine, and I still couldn't find the words. But I told her more than I'd intended to. It came out in pieces, over nights, in the dark when we were talking, and I'd say something, and she'd stay quiet in a way that left room for more, and more would come. She never flinched. That's the thing I want to say about Ruth then. She is not a woman who flinches. You can put a hard thing in front of her, and she will look at it straight, and she will not look away. I'd known that about her for 30 years, and I had known it, but in those nights I understood it differently. Understood what it costs a person to do that, to keep looking when looking is hard, and how rare it is, and how much I had not deserved it and she had given it anyway. One night in the second week, I told her something I hadn't planned to tell anyone. I'd been out in country where violence was common, where you saw people treated the way you shouldn't treat livestock, and I had done things in response to that, things that were necessary, things I do not regret in the accounting of them, but things that had changed the texture of the world for me, made it harder, less forgiving. I told her something partial about one of those incidents, not the whole of it, not the worst of it, just enough that she'd understand the weight I'd been carrying. She listened in the dark without moving. When I was done, she was quiet a long time, long enough that I thought she'd gone to sleep or decided she had nothing to say. Then she said, "Was there another way to handle it?" I thought about it honest. "No," I said. "Then stop turning it over," she said. "You've turned it enough. You're wearing a groove in it." "It's not always a choice," I said. "I know," she said. "But when you have any choice at all in whether to keep picking it up, put it down." It was not a complicated thing to say. It was not wisdom you couldn't find elsewhere. But she said it plain, and she said it without flinching, and she said it from 3 inches away in the dark, and that's what made it land. One night, maybe 3 weeks in, I told her about the mud in Montana and the horse. I don't know why I started there. I'd been lying in the dark, and I said, "I lost Gus in Montana," and she said, "I know, I thought he'd make it back with you," and I said, "He didn't, and what bothered me wasn't losing him. What bothered me was what I felt when I lost him," and she said, "What did you feel?" I said, "Not much." Silence. "And that scared me," I said. She was quiet a while. Then she said, "It should have, but Harlan, you're telling me about it. You're here in the dark next to me telling me it scared you. That's not a hollow man." I didn't answer. "A hollow man doesn't know the difference," she said. "A hollow man isn't scared of going hollow. He just goes. You knew, you kept knowing, that's what brought you home." I lay there with that. "You always did give me more credit than I had coming," I said. "I give you exactly what you have coming," she said, "not a bit more." There was a night, I think it was in the 3rd week, where I woke up from something bad enough to leave me sitting up, and I sat there on the edge of the bed with my hands hanging and my chest doing something wrong, and she didn't say anything. She just sat up beside me and put her back against the headboard and didn't touch me, because touching is not always the right answer, and didn't speak and just was there. Present. Awake and present and not afraid of it. After a while my chest leveled out. "How many nights did you do this alone?" I said. "Plenty," she said. "Not this, other things." "I'm sorry I wasn't here for the other things." She didn't tell me it was okay. She didn't tell me she'd been fine. She said, "I know you are," and we sat there in the dark until I was ready to lie back down. That was the marriage resumed. Not made new, resumed. Taken back up from where it had been left. You don't rebuild a thing like that from scratch. You find the seam where it was interrupted and you take up the thread, and it's not smooth at the seam, but it's continuous, and continuous is what matters. Elsa came on a Sunday, 3 weeks after I got back. She brought the boy, Martin, who was 2.5 and had Elsa's coloring and the Prout jaw and absolutely no opinion about me whatsoever, which was honest and appropriate. He was interested in the dog, which we had now, a brindle cattle dog Ruthen had gotten 2 years back and named Clay. My daughter. I had not been there for most of what she'd become. I want to say that plainly because I think there's a tendency to paper over those losses with the reunion, and I don't want to do that. I had not been there when she was 17 or 18, or when she met Prout, or when she married him, or when Martin was born. I had missed all of that. There is not an accounting for it that ends clean. She was 26, tall like her mother, with a steadiness in her that was her mother's also. She looked at me for a long time when she came through the gate, the fixed gate, and then she walked up and she held me, and it was not a child's hold. It was a grown woman holding her father back from somewhere distant, and I stood there in the yard and let her. "You look terrible," she said into my shoulder. "I know. Are you going to stay this time?" "Yes." She pulled back and looked at me. She had her mother's eyes, that same darkness, that same steadiness. "Okay," she said, and that was all she said. We went inside. Prout was a quiet man with a good handshake and the calloused hands of someone who worked. I liked him in the first 10 minutes, which is about all the information I needed. He didn't try to ingratiate himself. He sat down at the table and talked about feed prices and cattle with a practicality that told me he knew the land. He asked my opinion about something and listened when I gave it, and that was the full extent of what I needed from him. Martin fell asleep on the kitchen floor with the dog, which is the right place to fall asleep when you are 2.5. I sat at the table and looked at my family, all of it. What was left of it, what had grown up in my absence, what had kept itself whole without me. And there was grief in it, genuine grief at what I'd missed, but there was something else too, something like astonishment, that it had held, that she had held it. After dinner, when Prout had taken the boy outside to look at horses and Calvin had gone with them, and Elsa was helping her mother with dishes, I sat on the porch in the rocking chair. Elsa came out after a while, drying her hands, and stood at the rail. "She missed you," Elsa said. "I know. I mean really missed you, not just," she stopped. She never talked about it, she just went quiet sometimes. At night mostly. I'd be up for water and I'd see her sitting in the kitchen in the dark, and she'd say she couldn't sleep and it was fine, and I knew what it was. I looked at the yard. "I'm sorry," I said. And I meant it about everything, about the nighttime kitchen silences and the 8 years and the girl waiting at the gate and all of it. "I know," she said. She didn't say it was fine. She didn't absolve me. She just said she knew and came and sat on the step below me for a while, and that was the start of something. What brought me back? I've thought about it enough that I owe it some kind of plain saying. There were months toward the end of those 8 years when I couldn't have told you I was coming home. I had become someone who moved and did what was needed and didn't think past the next thing. The obligation I'd undertaken was finished, and there was nothing stopping me from riding south and finding something to do in some other town, becoming some other iteration of myself in some place where nobody knew what I'd started out as. I thought about it. Not because I didn't love them. I want to be clear about that too. But love and the ability to act on love are not always the same thing. I had love and I had lost the ability for a while to believe the love meant what it should. I had gotten too far into the hollow to trust my own perceptions. A man who's been out in it long enough starts to believe that the people he loves have adjusted to his absence, have folded it in, and don't need him coming back and disrupting the new arrangement. He tells himself this like it's consideration for them. It isn't. It's cowardice dressed up as generosity. I knew that somewhere. I knew it and I used it as a reason to stay away a little longer, and then the obligation was done and I stayed away anyway. And there were 2 months in northern New Mexico where I lived in a single room above a saloon in a town that had no reason to know my name, and that was fine with me. I worked some horses, took some meals, Slept. Didn't write letters because I'd stopped writing letters a couple years earlier, which is its own accounting. One morning I woke up and I was looking at the ceiling of that room, rough plank ceiling, a water stain in the corner shaped like nothing, and I understood something. I was afraid. Not of the land or the work or the hard parts of coming back. I was afraid that I'd get there and I'd look at the life we'd built and the people in it and I would feel the glass. That distance I described to Ruth Ann later, that looking through glass. I was afraid I'd come back and feel nothing that I was supposed to feel, and that would prove something I didn't want proved. I lay there looking at the water stain, and I thought about the gate. What I kept coming back to, and this is what I mean when I say it's the whole of the thing, was that gate. I know how that sounds, a gate. But I had left it crooked. It had been bothering me since the second spring we were on the place, and I'd always meant to fix it and I never did, and I left it like that, and there was something in knowing that the gate sat crooked at the end of the lane that I could not get comfortable with. It was not metaphor. I am not a man for metaphor. It was just a gate that needed fixing and I had left it that way. If I was the kind of man who left crooked things crooked on purpose, I could stay in that room above that saloon. If I was the kind of man who fixed what he'd left wrong, I had to go home and fix it. I started riding north. 3 days out of that town, I almost turned back. Not for reasons I'm proud of, because it was easier not to. Because the roan was comfortable on the south-headed trail, and the weather was good and ahead of me, there was difficulty. I pulled up on a rise somewhere in the middle of that calculation, and sat there on the horse looking at the country for a long time. I thought about Ruth then, not her voice or her face particularly, though both of those came in their time, but the specific quality of her, the steadiness, the not flinching, the way she'd said 30 years earlier when I'd asked her to marry me and told her the land I was looking at was raw and unproven and it was going to be hard. She'd said, "I know that, I'm saying yes anyway." That was Ruth then. Eyes open, yes anyway. I thought either she gave up on me or she didn't. Either way, I need to know. I turned the horse back north. Because of a gate. Because of all the things the gate stood for without standing for them on purpose. Because I am Harlan Cade and I built that fence and I hadn't fixed it and I needed to fix it and I needed to come home and find out what I was coming home to. What I found was that she'd kept the chair. And the chair turned out to be the thing that mattered. Not metaphor. Just a chair on a porch that a woman had left empty for 8 years, either because she couldn't bring herself to sit in it or because she'd known something she hadn't let herself know, and either way the result was the same. The chair was there when I got back, and I sat down in it and something released. I want to tell you about a morning in November. Maybe 6 weeks after I got back. The first real snow had come in overnight, not much, 2 or 3 inches, but enough to lay white across everything, the yard, the barn roof, the backs of the cattle on the south slope. I was up before Ruth then, which was unusual, and I built up the fire and put the coffee on and went out to the porch in the gray pre-dawn light. The land was quiet the way it gets under snow. That particular silence that isn't absence of sound but something heavier, like sound being held. I stood there, coffee in hand, and looked at it. The gate was white across the top rail. The cottonwoods had snow in their upper branches, and the weight of it was bending them just slightly, a familiar bend I could not possibly have known I'd missed but apparently had. The barn door had a rime of ice along the bottom edge where Paco had pulled it shut the night before and the frost had sealed it. Calvin's horse was visible in the paddock, standing with her head down and her back end to the wind, the way horses do. And I could feel the place. That's what I want to say. After weeks of looking at it and seeing it but not quite feeling it, the way I described, that glass between me and the real, I was standing there and I could feel it. The cold in my lungs had a particular quality, that exact altitude and latitude quality, nothing like the cold anywhere else I'd been. The give of the porch boards under my feet was familiar. The third step, which had always had the knothole, made it sound as I'd shifted my weight, that specific hollow complaint. The weight of my own boots on my own boards, the weight of the coffee cup in my hand, the smell of wood smoke from the chimney above me mixing with the cold air below. Real and present, no glass. I don't know what changed. It was not a single thing. It was weeks of chopping kindling and fixing fence, and eating at my own table and sleeping in my own bed and talking in the dark with my wife, and the weeks had done something I couldn't have forced. The land had worked its way back in through whatever cracks were available. The work had done it partly. The chair had done it some. The dark conversations had done it. Calvin and I side by side on a fence line had done it. Elsa holding me in the yard had done some part of it. You can't force a thing like this. You can only stay and do the work and let it come in its own time. Ruth then came out about 20 minutes later. She had her coat on over her nightgown, same as that first night on the porch, and she stood beside me and looked at the snow and didn't say anything right away. She looked at what I was looking at, the way you do when you've come out to stand beside someone. You look at what they're looking at first, to understand the thing before you speak into it. Cattle are fine, I said. I checked. She looked at me sidelong. I know they're fine, she said. Paco checked at first light. So did I said. A pause. You were up before Paco, she said. I'm usually up before Paco, I said. She looked at me again, this time longer. Something in her face settled, not quite a smile, not quite relief, something between the two, something that was its own thing. She looked at me the way she had in the yard on the first day, mapping the territory, but this time there was something different in it. Recognition, maybe. The particular recognition of something found. She put her hand on my arm. Just rested it there on the outside of my coat, her hand over my forearm. Not holding on, not clutching, just placed there. The way you place a hand on something to feel if it's real, to confirm the thing is solid. There you are, she said, quiet. I looked at her. There I am, I said. We stood there in the snow quiet with the coffee steam curling up between us and the land white and still and new, and I could feel my own weight on the boards, my own chest pulling air, my own land laid out before me, all of it present and real and mine, and her hand on my arm, and that was enough. That was every bit of enough. I want to finish with the gate. Because I said the gate was the thing, and I should make it plain. I fixed it in the first week I was back. Reset the post, rehung the hardware, got it hanging clean. Took the better part of an afternoon, because setting a post right means digging down past the soft layer, and I was working with ground that had 8 years of settling on it. I dug it by hand, set the new post in gravel and compacted earth, let it stand overnight before I hung the hardware. Did it right the first time, which is how I should have done it the first time. And then one morning, Ruth then came out and stood in the yard and looked at it, and I was watching her from the porch. And she looked at that gate a good while, the way it hung level, the way it swung clean, and then looked back at me. About time, she said. Which was exactly right. Which was the only right thing to say, not thank you, not welcome back. Not I'm glad you're home, though all of those things were real and I knew it. Just about time. Accountability and acknowledgement in 2 words, and then we moved on. I think about that sometimes. The efficiency of a woman who knows you well enough to say the full thing in 2 words. That was the start of it. That was the beginning of me coming back, not arriving at the gate but fixing it. The gate and the chair and the weeks of work and the nights in the dark and her hand on my arm in the first snow. That's what a homecoming is, I think. Not the arriving, the fixing, the slow working your way back into the shape of a life. The people willing to let you, which is the part you can't manufacture and can't deserve in advance. You can only receive it and try to be worth it going forward. Calvin forgave me in the spring. Not with words, he's not a man for words the way some are. But with a particular look, he gave me one morning when we were riding out to check the east pasture, and he said something about the ranch, Some plan he'd been thinking about for improving the water situation on the upper slope. And he said it the way you say a thing to someone whose opinion you're actually asking for, not just performing the asking. And I gave him my opinion, and he listened to it and weighed it and gave me back his thinking, and that was it. That was the forgiveness. Not stated, just present. Elsa writes letters, which she didn't used to do, and brings Martin out on Sundays when the weather allows. The boy is 3 now and has opinions about everything and no fear of horses, which is Elsa's temperament showing through. He calls me Grandpa Harlan, all one word, like it's a single name. Paco Reyes is still here and we work well together, and one afternoon he said to me, "Mr. Cade, you're a different man than you were," and I said, "Worse or better?" And he thought about it and said, "Different," which was honest, and I respected it. She was willing. That's the thing I come back to. Ruth then. She did not have to be. She had built a life that worked, that had its own rhythm and its own dignity. She could have looked at the hollowed-out man who rode up that lane and said, "This is not what I was keeping the place for," and she would not have been wrong to say it. 8 years is a long time. A person has a right to close a door that's been standing open that long. She didn't close it. I don't know what I did to deserve that. I have not found the accounting that adds up. I just know she looked at me in that yard when I rode in and saw the man behind the hollow, the man who was still in there behind all the years and the distance and the wearing down, and she put her hands on either side of my face in the cold October air, and she called me by my name, and she kept the chair because some part of her knew he'd need a place to sit when he finally got home. I'm still in it. That chair. Every morning, first light or close to it, coffee in hand, whatever the weather. Cold mornings with my breath showing, warm mornings with the cottonwoods moving, wet spring mornings when the rain comes off the peaks and smells like ice and pine and something clean. The gate hangs level at the end of the lane. The land runs out in every direction, and it's mine ours, and the work of it is real and daily, and I can feel it now, no glass. She knows where to find me. She doesn't always come out, and she doesn't need to, but sometimes she does. Sits on the top step in her coat, turns her face to whatever the morning is doing. Doesn't need to say anything. Neither do I. That is all I have to tell you. That is everything.